Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm glad that you're here. For those of you that don't know who I am, I'm Steve Krogh. I'm a pastor here at Grace, and this is the second time that I'll be giving this particular presentation. The first time we didn't record it, it was kind of a run through to get comfortable with the material. This time around, it'll be similar material, but it will go into a little bit greater depth than the first time around. And we're also recording this so that later on it will be on our website and you can check it out there as well. So the material that we're going to cover is so deep in terms of ideology and so forth that I'm going to be going not at a fast pace, primarily because the ideas that I'm going to be sharing with you and the history of how we got here is going to be, I'm guessing, foreign to you. And the reason being is because we all believe in objective truth. We all believe that 2 + 2 is 4. But the ideology that we will be looking at disregards objective truth and substitutes it with subjective truth. And we'll get to that as we go through. So welcome. If you want to know what to expect, we'll go for about 55 minutes thereabouts for session 1. We'll take a break so you can stretch your feet and grab some coffee and water and a little snack. And then after that, we'll come back in and do another session. And then after that, question and answer. So here we are. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for your presence here among us and pray that as we go into your gathering, that you be glorified and that you give us through your Spirit wisdom and discernment. You are the author of wisdom, and the discernment that you give us is essential for us to be able to discern between the spirits, what's of you, what's not of you. And so we pray that as we go over this material, you become glorified and equip us to be better able to articulate your kingdom, your presence, your truth. And this we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right. Social justice. You're going to find as we go through this that social justice is a one direction, if you will, of activity. Another one is critical race. That's another one. Critical gender. They all have their roots in the same place, but I titled this one Social Justice because this is the one that in particular Christians seem to get involved in, so I want to bring clarity to that. I want to start with a quote. This is from a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Friedrich Hayek, and he says this. This is a direct. I have come to feel strongly that the greatest service I render to my fellow men would be that I could make the speakers and writers among them thoroughly ashamed ever again to employ the term social justice. That's a strong quote. It's a very strong quote. I think as we go through what the material that we're through, you'll begin to see why he says what he says. Social justice, or the concept of social justice, is not ambiguous. It is very, very specifically defined and has a very specific meaning. And as we go through the material, I'm going to try to allow the people that have written about this, that have created this, that have pushed this to have for themselves, to speak for themselves. I'm not trying to put a slant on it or an opinion on it. I want to give you firsthand expression of what the authors and originators of what these ideas came from, give them voice. And why does this matter for us as Christians in particular? It matters because justice is essential for us. The Micah 6:8 is probably one of the most well-known verses when it comes to Christians in particular, believers, and justice. And you're probably familiar with the quote. Micah 6:8 says, "What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God?" So justice is not optional for us. It's essential. It's a requirement. It's something that we are instructed and commanded, if you will, to do. It's an imperative. And but as we get into it with regards to social justice, it can begin to be a little confusing, because what you and I have come to know as social justice throughout the 60s and 70s and so forth is not the same meaning that's being used now in common vernacular terms. Kevin DeLong is pastor, and he wrote, "Social justice is a nebulous term, unassailable to some and arousing suspicion in others." So I'm going to give you the Oxford Dictionary definition of social justice. Social justice is a noun, chiefly politics and philosophy justice at the level of a society or state as regards the possession of wealth, commodities, opportunities, and privileges. Then it says, see distributive justice. Distributive justice. Social justice, as it's commonly being used as a term, is distributive justice. William Young, who was a judge, a quote from him, "Social justice has evolved generally to mean state redistribution of resources and advantages to disadvantaged groups." That's going to be a key theme, groups. If you're taking notes, I would put all capital letters, and then I would highlight it, then I would circle it, then I'd underline it, and then I'd do it again on the next page. This is groupthink. There is no individualism here. Groups to satisfy their right to social and economic equality. And as I said, social justice is about groups, and specifically outcomes for groups. Outcomes for groups. Just to go over a little bit of the literature that's out there. This is from a book called Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. The book Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice is a book that is required reading in most colleges and universities. It is primarily used if you are going into the field of education, so that it would be required reading. But it's also used if you're studying and pursuing what's commonly referred to as grievance studies. What do I mean by grievance studies? Ethnic studies, African American studies, Chicano studies, feminist studies, queer studies, gay and lesbian studies, and yes, you can get a degree in all of those. That's something that you can acquire, and if you are pursuing that, this is required reading not only in colleges and universities, but in other institutions as well, and also in political science if you're pursuing that. And a quote from that book, Social Justice, is an analysis of how power, privilege, and oppression impact our experience of our social identities. Experience, not necessarily reality, but our experiences. And this is the shift, as I mentioned earlier, from objective truth that you can look at and come to agreement upon, as compared to subjective truth, which is based on one's own personal experience alone. And if you go through and, by the way, if you're not on our mailing list, email list, specifically for the social justice thing, you can sign up there and you'll be on our mailing list. Last time I shared a reading list, someone shared it with us, of all the materials that this person had read, and they're used in colleges and universities all over the place. One of these books, actually it's an essay called White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And Peggy McIntosh published it in 1989. The ideas were out there, but she actually published it. And this particular essay is the foundation for academic understanding today, the academic understanding. So what we're going into and what we're going to look at today and talk about today started in academia, worked its way through academia into the educational sphere of academia, so that it went into public education, and then from a public education, public institutions as well. And this particular essay is really a foundational work for the academic understanding of white privilege. And it's like a seminal paper, actually. But if you read it, there's not one footnote. And I don't know about you, but even in high school, if I wrote a paper, any kind of research paper, I had to have footnotes. I had to have sources. There's not one. And you'll find that most of the literature that's coming out of the writers of this, they cross-reference each other, but there's very little footnotes, if any, in this case. Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice, another way that it defines social justice is this: an analysis of how power, privilege, and oppression impact our experience of our social identities. Full and equal participation of all groups, there's that group identity again, in a society that is mutually shaped to meet their needs. Social justice includes a vision of society in which the distribution of resources is equitable. Equitable is or equity is another word that we're going to use frequently. It is something that, well, it's actually pretty straightforward when you think about it, but it can be confused with equality. And equality and equity are two different things, two different animals. Equality means, and is understood as being, everyone is equal under the law. Everybody has an equal opportunity. That's what equality means. Equity means the outcomes are the same for everybody. The example that I use is if you're in a classroom and it's equality-based, everybody has access to the information. Everybody has the same textbooks. Everybody hears the same lectures. Everybody has the same teacher. That's equality. Equity says, nope, everybody gets the same grade. And if this person gets a D and this person gets a B, then there's inequity, and as such, there's injustice. So I just wanted to use that as an example. I came up with that on my own. Hey, great. I didn't know if that was going to flop or... That's it for today. I got my... No, I'm... Okay. This is from a website called New Discourses. I very much encourage people to go to it, newdiscourses.com. And it's a little long, but it's worth it. And then I'm going to start getting into the history. So, just please listen to this, because I think it really summarizes it accurately. Social justice is the ultimate Trojan horse term, where it seems to mean one good thing, as most people understand it, social justice, a more fair and equal society, but actually means something else. That something else is very specific, and most people, if they knew what they were encountering, would be unlikely to accept it. The idea advertised by the phrase social justice doesn't match the ideology and worldview bearing the seemingly identical name. Social justice means something more specific. It means critical social justice. We're going to get into that. That's a key word, because if you're over, is anybody here over 60? Over 50? Right? We understand social justice based on what took place in the 60s, 70s, etc. This is something completely different. This is critical social justice. This is not Martin Luther King, okay? It's not civil rights movement. It has nothing to do with that. This is critical social justice. That word critical we're going to get to in a second. This is, in fact, an ideology that very aggressively pursues the social, cultural, institutional, and political installation and enforcement of a very specific and radical understanding of social justice as derived from various critical theories and their specific analysis of socially constructed dynamics of systems of power. As such, they do not necessarily seek to achieve social justice in the broad sense, or in the sense that many people would assume of the term. Instead, they seek to empower and enforce their particular worldview that revolves around one narrow and authoritarian interpretation of the concept. And just as a footnote, if you will, to that, they make clear that whenever the writers are writing on social justice, they use the term critical social justice to connect it to critical theory, critical race theory, and intersectionality. Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility, refers to that repeatedly. So let's go into the mission of what critical social justice is. And to do that, we're going to take a stroll down philosophical, ideological memory lane. Ready? Buckle your seat. Oh, you don't have seats. And it buckles. Brace yourself, Ethel. That's another one. We're going to go back, even though the ideas did not necessarily originate here, we're going to start with Karl Marx, not Groucho's brother. He brought into the world two concepts that are key for us to understand. The first was to study society in order to change it. Not to understand it. Science will study to understand. You know, you look at things, you observe things, you try to understand how things work, how they work in tandem, how they work together. No, the purpose is to study society in order to change it. How are we going to change it? That's key, because this eventually will turn into what is known as critical theory. We're not there yet, but this is its origin. This is what he unleashed into the world. The second thing that he brought into the world is what's called conflict theory. Conflict theory, as Karl Marx saw the world, was that every relationship in the entire world is set up in a continuous struggle or conflict between different groups of people. In Marx's day, it was happening in Russia. You had the bourgeois, the proletariat. But that's how he saw the world. Everybody was, so now all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but you begin to see how everybody is now put into a category. The beginnings of it. You've heard of the haves and there you go, I don't even have to tell you. That's the category that came out of that. And so Karl Marx saw the entire world set up with this conflict theory. And as such, he focused the conflict on economics. That was his focus. So if the workers could just unite and take over the means of production, then we could get to this utopia world. Remember Workers Unite? Remember the symbol? You'll see it now used by another social movement. But it's the same symbol. So his locus of conflict theory was in economics. That's how this is the beginning of it. Okay? However, everybody got this? Say no if you did. I'm just kidding. I'm changing the definition of terms to get you prepared for what we're going to study. All right. The Russian Revolution actually took place, but it didn't happen all over the world. And after Marx, there were people of the next generation of Marxists that were going, why isn't this happening all over the place? And you get one person in particular, and then the other is a group of people that took this ideology and began to develop it and apply it and work with it. And the first person is Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci. And this is the guy who came up with, he's an Italian Marxist, this concept of hegemony. Hegemony is the idea, like I said, Marx was focused on economics. If the workers could just unite, overthrow the capitalists, he hated capitalism. And if the workers could just unite and they would acquire the means of production, you could get to this perfect utopia that everybody got what was due them. The details will be worked out on the other side of the gulag, if you know your history. All right. That didn't happen. And so Gramsci says, you know what? It's not just economics. There's something in culture that's taking place too that's stopping this worldwide revolution. Remember, revolution. That was Marx's thing, and that's why he came up with the two foundational ideas that we talked about a moment ago. It didn't happen worldwide. They said, you know why? Because culture is also participating in this. It's not just economics. There's a whole cultural dynamic that's taking place. And there's people within a culture that are exercising oppression over the rest of the group that's in that culture. And that's why you're not seeing the revolution happening all over. It's not just economics. And he used this term, or he used it, the term was out there, but he used it to refer to a group within a culture that's exercising oppressive power over another group. It's called hegemony. Critical theorists then picked up on this idea and said, Now, critical theorists today, in referring to the United States, American culture, has labeled and identified the hegemonic powers in this country. They are, and not limited to, but primarily, you know what, I want to make it clear. Hopefully you wrote that down. This is the hegemonic cultural power. All right. This is the hegemonic power that critical theorists in their literature describe affecting American culture. White, male, heterosexual, cisgender, able-bodied, native-born, Christian. Yes, Christian. Christianity is considered by critical theorists, critical race theorists, critical gender theorists, as an oppressive force. And I'll have to say, I can kind of see what they're coming from, because if you go back to Karl Marx, the church was a very oppressive force at the time. Not that I'm throwing him a bone, but I'm just saying. Everybody know what? Does anybody not know what cisgender is? You need an explanation. Okay, cisgender is this. You got sexuality and biology. I'm sorry, sexuality and gender. Sexuality is biology. Okay, baby's born. Okay, plumbing says this: male, female. Gender is socially constructed identity. And you probably, as a younger person, were as exposed to it. I was in the beginning, but I was already beyond that by the time I was like in junior high. But the idea behind that is if you give a little boy a bunch of Barbie dolls, he'll act a certain way. But if you give a little girl guns, she'll act a certain way. In other words, you can construct a person's sexual identity. So sexuality is biology, gender is social construction. If your biology and your identity match, you are cisgender. Follow me on that? You know, I'm sporting the George Michael look. I'm cisgender. But if your biology doesn't match up with your identity, your biology says you're a male, but you don't feel male, you are now transgender. But then if you want to carry it to the next level and you go under the knife to do something about it, you are transsexual. That's where that comes from. Now let's take another stroll down memory lane. This is what Antonio Gramsci unleashed into the world as an idea. But there was another group, and that group also was asking the questions, why isn't this happening? Why isn't the revolution happening all over the world? And this group came to be known as the Frankfurt School. Now, the Frankfurt School, let's see if I can fix this here. There we go. Was a group of Marxists that started in Frankfurt, Germany, and eventually made their way to the United States. And what they did is they applied conflict theory, remember Marxist theory, conflict theory, and rather than apply it only to economics, the Frankfurt School applied conflict theory to culture. And as such, in 1937, Max Horkheimer, this is the birth of critical theory. So conflict theory in 1937, here's my thing. 1937, Max Horkheimer, I'll write it down and then immediately erase it because I need to put something. You can look that up. Horkheimer. 1937, he divided all thought, into two categories. First category is called traditional theory. This is your sciences, where your Baconian method, observation method, hypothesis, all that, philosophy, etc. 2 + 2 is 4, okay? And critical theory. He divided all thought into these two categories. Critical theory took Marx's conflict theory and began to work it. So critical theory focuses on not understanding society, but figuring out how you're going to change it. That's what critical theory does. It looks at all of the structures and tries to look at how it's failing people in order to pick at the scabs and tear it down. That's what critical theory is about. Okay? So, there's three things to critical theory that are very important for us to understand. They are essential to critical theory as it applies. First of all, you have to look at structures to decide or to determine, to figure out how they fail people. That's the first thing. Then you have to have a normative vision. Because if you're going to look at something to change it, you got to have something to change it to. So you have to have a normative vision. That normative vision is communism, because you're going to tear down the capitalistic system. It started with Karl Marx. Equity became the token word that's used to communism is equity is communism, the same thing. But they don't use that because people would be afraid. So use equity now. But that's the normative vision. And it also demands social activism. Because if you're going to look at something to change it and you have a vision of what you want it to be changed to, you have to do something to get there. So it, by nature, demands social activism. Those three things. Those three things. Now, even though thought was divided into these two categories, it still was under the umbrella of objective truth. 2 + 2 is 4. 4 + 4 is 8. Objective truth that we can both agree upon. That we can both say, yeah, that's true. However, and that was, by the way, the era of modernism. And for the most part, these two worked in tandem. Yeah, you were doing this, but you were also doing this. And you weren't severing and only doing this. You were keeping those together for the most part. That was modernism. Then we enter the era of postmodernism. And this is where things get really crazy. First of all, this is in the 60s. And this is a key idea. Hope I'm spelling that right. Because if I'm not, and my mom watches this, structuralism. Structuralism put into the world the idea that language forms our structures. Language itself is what forms and perpetuates the structures of society. Language itself. Hence, language now is a vehicle of power. Language is power. This was brought into the world, and because of that, because language is power, objective truth is inaccessible. Because every time I'm talking about something, I'm not relating truth about it, I'm applying power. Don't try to understand it. I'm not saying it makes sense. I'm saying this is the ideology that was introduced to the culture at the time that's now, in part, forming what we're having to deal with in our culture. So me giving this seminar is not about me distributing and sharing truth and knowledge. I'm exerting and applying power. If your head is spinning, it should. It doesn't make sense. That kind of makes sense if you're married. Oh, that's a joke. Come on, lighten up. Got to have a little fun. All right, structuralism. Please don't try to understand it, because this is not how you and I think. When you and I sit down and grab a cup of coffee and try to have a discourse, we're trying to come up with common understanding. We're not sitting down going, okay, now I'm going to exercise power over you. No, we're not doing that. But this is what structuralism believes. Now, Richard Rorty, this is a quote from him talking about structuralism. The world might be out there, but the truth is not out there. This idea was then carried by a French philosopher called Michel Foucault. Okay, this guy is very prominent in this historical narrative because he introduced into this world this idea. If language is power, then truth, knowledge, and power are the same thing. Truth, knowledge, power is the same thing. So you can talk about certain things and you can have truth statements in mathematics. Let's say I'm going to teach a third grader truth. 2 plus 2 is 4. That's a truth statement. But to look at that truth statement is to miss the point, because the point now is that somebody had the privilege to authenticate these truths. Somebody had the privilege to authenticate these, whether true 2 plus 2 might be 4, it might not, who cares? The point is that somebody had the privilege of going to a school, getting a degree in education, learning the language that exerts power and is exerting power in this classroom. That's what Foucault unleashed into the world. So truth claims, like I said, may be true or false, but there is a process that made them so. So if you're going to authenticate truth statements, you have scientists, and scientists have their own language, and that's an application of power. You see how a scientist can now be racist? Because they're exerting power. Or misogynist, or whatever. Okay, we'll get to that later. But so a scientist isn't just using language to talk about things as they are. That's traditional theory. They're exerting power. Not just scientists, mathematicians, philosophers, journalists, maybe not now, but back in the day. And so he put a real big wall between reality and our claims about truth. You can't know the truth because truth, knowledge, and power are all the same thing. So how are you going to know it's true? It's just an application of power. So, truth and knowledge are not, as you and I understand truth or knowledge, they're cultural constructs, because every culture is exerting power. The hegemonic group in the culture is exerting power by dictating the discourses, the language, the words, and the way that we use the words to exert power over the oppressed group. So you can never know what's true, because what it really is an application of power. Again, don't try to understand it. just take it at face value, because there's people that adhere to this wholeheartedly. And as long as you know where they're coming from, then you have a better idea of what's taking place, and you don't have to be confused. Because you and I don't look at it that way. If I say 2 + 2 is 4, you don't say, stop oppressing me. So now, truth, knowledge are cultural constructions, and truth and knowledge are the product of a social system and the power contained within that system. So truth is power, everything is power. Truth is nothing more than an application of power. You don't get a degree in something because you know it. You get a degree because you've been given the authentic realization of exerting power over this. That's how this ideology views the world. So power is no longer a weight that's pressing down from above. Power isn't this weight that comes from above that tells you, going this direction. Rather, it works through all of us like a grid. Because it's, remember, structuralism, it works through how we talk about things. And you and I are always talking about things. So every time that we're talking about things and thinking about things, using the language that we've learned to think about things, we're in this grid that is constantly at work forcing power between oppressor and oppressed. So it's everywhere all the time, and it's working through discourses. So, for example, you have medical discourses. This is how the medical people get the privilege to exert their power, because they use these terms, and you better adhere to the terms, and that's what's happening. That's the medical. Or if you're in law people are exerting power because this is the terms, and they get to authenticate these terms because of the structures that are in place. So this is how critical theorists see the world. And the dominant discourses were, I should say, the locus of power for Marx was economics. Now the locus of power is in discourses, how we talk about things. That's why language is so, don't you use that gender language with me. It's oppressive. That's where that comes from. Language is now the locus or the focus of where this power is exerted. So, because of this, society is ordered by a conspiracy theory where everybody is an unwilling conspirator. You don't even know it. You grew up in a culture, you learned a language, and you breathe that language, you dream in that language, you write in that language, and you can't even see it for what it is. You're just exerting power. You're an oppressor, and you don't even know it, you poor people. This is the ideology behind this. This, by the way, this ideology that power runs through our discourses, it's in everything that we think, it's in every conversation, it's in every interaction, it runs through our structures of education and school system to authenticate this. This idea that power runs through everything like a grid is what is referred to as systemic power. So when you hear systemic racism, this is what people mean. They don't mean that there's a law on the books that's inhibiting somebody from X, Y, or Z. They mean this. And the only way to get rid of this is to burn everything down and start from the ground up. Because that's what revolution does. Now, systemic power. Everybody is participating all the time. It's in how we speak. It's in how we think. Truth is inaccessible because nobody can claim truth. Nobody can claim it because nobody is objective. We are all subject to our biases, and our biases are located in the cultures in which we find ourselves. You will never know the truth. You can't know the truth. Truth is power. Power is exerted in our discourses, our social constructs. So we're all not able to do that. This, by the way, is the beginning of wokeism. Because it takes a lot of privilege to deconstruct systematic oppression. You can't do it if you're the oppressed. It takes privilege to disassemble the whole language and so forth and so on. So now we've gone from this. Is this sinking in yet? It shouldn't. If you get this and this makes, that makes total sense, let's talk after this. We've got deprogramming. No, I'm just kidding. Remember back in the 70s when the cult thing was a big thing and you had to deprogram them? Gosh, I long for those days compared to what we have now. So what we've done now is we've gone historically from truth, 2 + 2 is 4, to my truth, your truth. Remember those days? Anyone remember Phil Donahue? He was big into that. Oh, that's just your truth and my truth and this truth. And well, you don't have, but in this system, can't tell what's true because of the way that power, knowledge, and truth are all the same thing. So where do you find truth in this ideology? This is where you find it. Truth is found Truth is now located here in the subjective lived reality of oppression. That's the only place you can find truth. Everything else is just an application of power. This is the locus of where truth can be located, and only here. The subjective, remember I said you get rid of objective truth. Subjective, lived reality of oppression. So, that being the case, yeah, question. And for the camera, I'll repeat the question so that people that are online can hear what you have to say. Go ahead, Sam. How is it established? Well, these are critical theorists. Critical theorists, by the way, made their way. They started in Frankfurt, Germany. They made their way then to, I want to say they made their way to Switzerland, I believe they did. And then eventually after that, made their way to America in, I'm looking for my notes here. Yeah, they left Germany in 1933 and they went to Switzerland. And then in 1935, they left Switzerland and came to New York at Columbia University. That's how it makes its way. That's the premise. Now they're just talking amongst themselves. And then the paper will go over here, and then this academic over here. But it starts in academic. Once it makes its way there, then it works its way down. But lest I get off. So the lived experience, the subjective lived reality experience, lived reality is experienced. The subjective lived reality of oppression. That's where you find the truth. So if this is the hegemonic power in our culture, then the oppressed are the people that do not have ink in there. The oppressed are non-white, non-male, non-heterosexual, non-cisgender, non-able body, non-native born, and non-Christian. Okay. So this is where the truth is going to be found. So it's, and these are, by the way, your identity, as I said previously, is not individual. You are simply a construct of your culture. That's all you are. The reason why you think the way you do is not because you think the way you do from your own being. It's because you've been conditioned to think the way you do based on culture that has formed the constructs by which you talk about things and think about things and relate to things. There is no human being. There's just cultural constructs. So your identity as a non-white is who you are. There's no other person behind that. There may be a person that experiences things here and there, but for the most part, that's where you get your identity. I'm going to give you a quote, and then I'm going to, to make my point, Kimberly Crenshaw wrote this. Mapping the Margins, by the way, is a big book that came out in 1989. Kimberly Crenshaw and Bell Hooks both they're black feminists, and they are black feminists in terms of that's what they are writing about and talking about and propagating, but they are also black feminists. They're both the same. And this is the quote from her, Kimberly Crenshaw. There's something much more important and powerful about the statement, quote, I am black, than I am a person who happens to be black, because the second I'm the person who happens to be black, that second puts the universal humanity in front of the identity. Did you hear? She is being taught all over universities that your identity is in this category or this category is more important than your universal humanity. That's her quote. We just had in our particular denomination a transfer of bishoprics, and there's a new position within our structure. And there's a person that has just filled this position, and the position now that's coming out of our synod office is an assistant to the bishop for authentic diversity, inclusive community. That's now a position of a major Lutheran church denomination, a position. What are you going to do? You're going to propagate this. That's what you're going to do. I'm going to allow us to take a breather. So go and enjoy some water, I knew that once I started teaching this, it could be very disturbing. So we have various wines and beers out there for everybody. Don't want to freak everybody out. You have to have some kind of crutch, baby, and that's, we're in wine country. So. we left off with a quote from Kimberly Crenshaw saying there's something more important and powerful about the statement, I am, because this is who people are now in this category. This is, by the way, this is all critical theory. Critical theorists are the ones that are promoting critical theory. We're going to get to the first application of that became race. So that's where you get critical race theory. But there's critical gender theory, and there's critical this theory, and so forth. There's critical social justice. It's all coming from the same place, just an application to a different part of society. So Kimberly Crenshaw, there's something much more important and powerful about the statement, I am black, than, quote, I am a person who happens to be black. Because the second, I am a person, puts universal humanity in front of the identity. Now, just a little bit quick review. Power works through everybody. It is systemic. It works at the level of discourses, how we talk about things. That came from structuralism. To create systemic oppression. Systemic oppression goes all the way back to conflict theory from Marx. Conflict theory became focused on economics, later culture. And in conflict theory, you only have oppressors and oppressed, and that's it, because everybody's in conflict. And so now it works at the level of discourses to create systemic oppressions. These oppressions are based in identity categories. The oppressions are based in identity categories. So here we have our categories, because this is the hegemonic power of our particular culture. This is exerting power through our discourses, through our language, onto the various oppressed groups. So critical theorists said, what are we going to start with? Let's start with race. We'll start there. So we'll apply critical theory to race, and hence is born critical race theory, which is everything that we covered in the first session applied strictly to race. Everything is systemic power. It's happening everywhere. It's not a matter of if it's happening, it's how it's happening. How are you going to identify it, etc. So that brings into the dynamic of what is called intersectionality. Now, Kimberly Crenshaw, bell hooks, black feminist, they came up with the idea of I don't know if they came up with it. They introduced it and started moving the idea. In 1989, was a book called Mapping the Margins. And remember, I said they were black feminists. So what happens if you remember? Anyone remember the feminist movement? Did you recover your burning bras? Remember that? They looked at the feminist movement and said, "Wait a second, this is a white thing. It has nothing to do with black women, so we're left out of the mix." And then when the civil rights came around, it was black power and so forth. Wait a second, you're just talking about black male power. We're left out of the mix. So they began to push in 1989, mapping the margins. The margins were we're women, but the feminist movement was Jane Fonda, et cetera, and so forth. So they came up with this, what's called intersectionality, which means if you're feeling a certain level of oppression as a non-white, okay, but you're still male, you're experiencing X degree of oppression. But if you're non-white and non-male, you've now doubled your experience of oppression. And if you're non-white, if you are Latino, female, lesbian, now you have 3 times the amount of oppression. If you are non-white, if you are Latino, female, lesbian, transgender, you get the idea. That's your 4th level. That's called intersectionality. That's called intersectionality. That came into, and that basically, intersectionality takes identity politics and puts it on steroids. So, okay, yes, I'm a black man, so I have to understand that I've been oppressed by this white person, but I also have to understand that I oppress women because I'm a man. And so, That's why all the microbreweries are doing fantastic right now. You didn't know this, but it really developed as a coping mechanism for us trying to grab them. So, with this dynamic, and remember I said, I don't know if I still have it on this side or not. I'll go back over on the other side of the spectrum here. Whoa. You got this? This is the only place where you can find truth now, according to this ideology. And you should see when this stuff hits theology, you're looking for racism in every text. Anyway, because of the idea entered in through Foucault that knowledge, truth, and power are the same thing, things like faith, reason, and facts, things that we all can at one time agree upon, they are no longer those things. What they are applications of power by people who have fooled themselves into thinking that they are truths. So where is truth? Like I said, it's in the subjective lived experience, reality, subjective lived reality of oppression. So one culture cannot judge another culture because truth is a cultural construct or artifact, and all cultures are equal, every single one. So you got, and by the way, I don't know if you ever remember, but maybe it started in the early 90s, the word community. And then you would be attached with an identity community. So the Black community, Hispanic community, gay community, this community, that community, no hair community, etc. Those things. And I was like, that doesn't make any sense because we're all in the same neighborhoods, kind of. But that's not how they do it if you're doing identity politics or looking at it this way. And so one culture cannot judge another culture because truth is a cultural construct and all cultures are equal except the one produced by. This is the only culture that is not equal and does not have the truth. This one. Anything after the Enlightenment era. Because it was during the Enlightenment that you had the advance, the growth and dynamic of sciences, biology sciences, chemistry, all that stuff. But it came out of this culture. So this culture cannot speak truth to anything. Because truth is found in the subjective lived reality of oppression. So, that's the one that's bad. Here's a quote from Robin DiAngelo, a very prominent author. She says this, and this is a quote. Objectivity is something that we should consider neither possible nor desirable. Instead, we should have subjectivism, the subjective experience of the lived reality of systemic oppression is the only and highest truth. This is what's being taught in universities to education majors. It's trickling down from education majors to the public schools. To the extent that my brother, who has 2 children in the same school district I grew up in, is having to deal with this. And the superintendent said, we are not teaching critical race theory. And then my brother forwards an email of the assignment given to his son for an English class that said, give the definition of intersectionality. Oh, we're not teaching it. Yes, you are. But this is what he's having to deal with. Now, again, Robin DiAngelo, objectivity is something that we should consider neither possible nor desirable. That's why you go to school in the first place, is to get objective. Instead, we should have subjectivism. The subjective experience of the lived reality of systemic oppression is the only and highest truth, end quote. However, because of that, it carries an ethical imperative. One, because she's a critical theorist. Critical theorists came out of Marxism. Critical theorists. One, make it visible. Two, tear it apart. So a critical theorist's job is to find where there is oppression, make it visible, and tear it down. So you can burn things. That's Marxism. You tear it down. It's a revolution. So the question, given this dynamic, is not, did racism, so let's apply critical theory to race. The question is not, did racism take place, but how did it manifest in that situation? It's not, did it take place? It's taking place because power is in everything that we do, everything that we think, everything that we say, every word that we know. So it's not a matter of did it take place, it's how did it take place. I'll give you an example. I'm borrowing it, it's not my own. You're a business owner, a small little business, let's say. You're the only one in the shop at the time, and for whatever business you have to spend some time with each client. Maybe you're a tailor or something like that. And two people walk through the door at the same time. You realize for whatever reason that they're not together, but one of them, say, is black and one is white. Who do you go and wait upon first? Anyone want to go to the white person first? Oh, you racist. Anybody going to go to the black person? No one? You're just going to close up shop? What are you, California now? Going to move to South Carolina? This is how a critical theorist looks at it, critical race theorist in this case. If you go to the black person and help them, you're racist because you don't believe that a black person can be left alone in your shop for unattended. That's one possibility. The other possibility is you really don't want to see that want to spend time with that black person, but you don't want anyone to think that you're a racist, so you're going to do it to cover up your own racism. Or you're going to deal with a white person rather than the black person because you like white people. It doesn't matter what you choose, you're a racist. That's how this stuff works. And only a critical theorist is given the authority to point it out, call it out, and destroy it. So that now, if you're in real estate, you can't refer to the master bedroom, right, as a master bedroom. Why? Would you like to explain? Because a critical theorist said, that's racist. Did anyone say, hey, I'm offended by it? No. A critical theorist, that's job is to find it, not, am I still on camera? Not to know if it's there, but to find where it is, call it out, and destroy it. It's called cancel. So what happens then is, master bedroom was a term that came up, I believe, in the 1920s from the Sears catalog. But a critical theorist says, this could be offensive to this person, so you're not allowed to do that. This is where it goes. So the job of the critical theorist is to make it visible and promote activism, generally burn it down. And the truth doesn't matter because you can't find the truth. Only they know the truth. So let's talk about, in this context, diversity. Ever heard that word recently? What does that mean? I'm conscious of my time here. Diversity. Okay. You and I probably have a working definition of diversity that is different than a critical theorist. You and I'm guessing, understand diversity as a good thing, meaning, well, you know what? Let's get other people's opinion in this thing. I don't want to just have my opinion. I want to have your opinion, and we'll just see, your opinion. We'll bring them together, and we can have a diverse group going forward. It builds everybody up. I don't want to have just this kind of music. I want to have this kind of music, etc. Diversity being a good thing in that way. That's not how a critical theorist looks at it. A critical theorist looks at diversity as anyone who is in alignment with critical theory, but has a different shade of color. So you could be, say, a black person, but if you don't say, no, I don't believe in that, I've never been oppressed, you haven't been oppressed, that's because you have subconsciously internalized your own oppression as normal. And you need me to tell you that you are oppressed. Thank God for the critical theorists telling you, and if you don't agree with that, then you are not authentic, because the only truth is to be found in the subjective, lived reality of oppression, and only I, as a critical theorist, can point that out to you. Because you've absorbed it in culture, you just think that's the norm. That's how they look at diversity. Critical theorists with a different tone of skin. Inclusion. What does that mean then? If you're taking everything that we've learned, you apply it to inclusion. Inclusion means that if you're going to now bring anybody that is in, really fix this, but I didn't do a great job. Anybody that's in this particular group into the mix, okay, for inclusion. That means anything that can be construed as offensive or uncomfortable to any member of a minoritized group is not inclusive, which means speech codes. And if you don't think you've been affected, you already probably have a speech coach or a speech code person, a critical theorist in your head saying, I better not say this, because this person might be offended. It's already worked its way in. Better not say this. Even though that person may never be offended, this person is telling you that this person is telling you that that person is being oppressed by what you say, even though this person didn't say anything. Aunt Jemima's a great example. That family's proud of that picture. But a critical theorist said, no, that's racist, get rid of it. Bonk. That's how it works. That's inclusion. Speech codes. Anybody who could link the thing that was said or done to a system of power or upholding a system of power has grounds to tell you that what you said or did was inappropriate and your intentions didn't matter. That's where it goes. That's what inclusion is. So if we're going to include, then we have to, we can't say this because this person may be offended. We can't say this because this person may be offended. So it's speech codes. You're not allowed to say this or use this word or use this phrase or use. That's how it works. Also, because of the hegemonic power in this culture, they have a phrase called the permanence of the white man gaze. Meaning that particular phrase is that this hegemonic power is all throughout culture. It's everywhere. You can't get rid of it. So if you are in one of these oppressive groups, the only way to break free from it is to create a group where only you belong and none of these people are allowed to come in. So you have only black spaces. You have only black graduations, if you see that. We call that segregation. They call it desegregation. You see how you're going, what? I'm going to take a moment. Now, remember I said they have to have a normative vision? In order to get to that normative vision of equity, it has to be done by force, and equity is now the standard. So I'm going to use an example that we have in California. Remember Proposition 16? It failed. I don't know if you ever remember. That was on the last ballot. Proposition 16 said that we are allowed to get rid of our discriminatory regulations. California put certain rules into place saying you can't discriminate. Remember the anti-discrimination laws? You've heard of those? Okay. You can't discriminate based on a person's religion or their ethnicity or their gender or their hair follicles. You can't discriminate against anyone in any of those ways. But if you're not going to discriminate, then that may mean that you're not going to get equity. Meaning you might not have enough people of one of these groups represented in an institution. So Proposition 19 was a proposition to say we're going to get rid of all the discrimination laws. Because if you discriminate against someone based on gender, race, that's a good thing to discriminate if you get equity. So in California, they had a rule, if you have a company and it's so big, you are forced to have a female on your board. And they wanted to get rid of the discrimination so that they could impose equity. So that now if you have a company that's so big on your board, you have to have one of these, 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 one of these. Or you could play it right and get one person that's one of these, 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 one of these. And you're laughing because it's all over the place and you see how ridiculous it is, but it keeps marching forward. Okay, now this was a quote from Ibram X. Kendi. If you don't know who he is, you certainly know his ideas, because they're everywhere, and it's no longer an issue of either being a racist or you're not a racist. You're either a racist because you're part of the system, and the only way to not be that is to be an anti-racist. And he has a quote that says, if anti-discrimination produces inequity, it is racist. If anti-discrimination produces inequity, it is racist. If discrimination produces equity, then it's anti-racist. And this man is being paid $20,000 to $40,000 an hour. Ibram X. Kendi, I-B-R-I-M Kendi with a K. I'll write his name up on the board. Okay, so I-B-R-A-M-X, how to be an anti-racist. Well, let me just go back a second. Talked about it at the Frankfurt School. We did that. We covered that. We'll talk about equity for a little bit. Equity and, like I said, equality are not the same. Equality means, and equality, by the way, that doesn't exist in the system. It's only equity. You can only see things in terms of equity, and that's how you propagate and move forward with this ideology. Equity focuses on outcomes rather than opportunity. And because of that, Harvard and Yale are both being sued because they found out they have too many Asians. Equity means that the proportion of Asians in American culture should be equally represented as the same proportion of the student body. And if you have more, then it is inequitable and it is racist. So we're going to discriminate against you because you are Asian, and we're going to keep adding factors until we get equity. That's why they're being sued. That's where equity gets you. And if you think about it, in as much, what do you got, whether you want to call it communism or equity, it's the same goal, it's the same thing. That being your objective norm that you're going for has to disregard the fact that nowhere in this world does that ever play out. God is inequity. God is unjust because he doesn't make every single human person the exact same. He makes some good at sports, some not so good. He's unjust. Because in a just world, everyone would have the same outcome and look the same and have the same temperaments, the same talents, the same gifts, the same everything. Do you want that? No. But that's what they're going for. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of, this is now the, talked about the mission, intersectionality, group outcomes. So this is the mission then of social justice as you go forward. And the people that are pushing this forward are, like I said, critical theorists. The first is you identify different advantaged groups. You just have to identify them. And if you notice, they're popping up. I didn't even know that was a group. Now that's a group? That's a group? That's a thing now? Yeah, left-handed, black, non-native born. I mean, you try to figure out who's all being oppressed, and then you have to give them an identity. Okay? So the first step in this is to identify disadvantaged groups. The second then is to assess group outcomes. And you see this happening all the time. Well, COVID-19. In a perfect world, a virus would kill proportionally the same of every single race. And if it's not, then there's racism, there's oppression. You hear it in the discourse regarding COVID-19. The way we're handling it is racist. Why? Because these people, wait a second. What about working conditions? There's nothing, you cannot see the world outside of this very narrow viewpoint of oppressor, oppressed, and systematic power. And that is it. There are no other factors. None. And if you don't see that, it's because you have been fooled by the culture into thinking that you know what is true, and only I, as a critical theorist, know what is true, so it's my job to tell you what's true. And glazed look. Drink the Kool-Aid. So first, identify disadvantaged groups. 2, assess group outcomes. 3, assign blame for disparate outcomes. The blame is always a racial component. Then you distribute power and resources to redress these grievances. By the way, you're going to start to hear this more and more. Remember, with regards to the climate, it was at one time global warming. Actually, if you want to go back into the 70s, in which I was a kid and started forming, it was still global cooling. And that scared the bejeepers out of me because I know what it's like in January in Minnesota. And I don't want to live there year round. And it's in Time magazine, I remember. And then that switched from global cooling to global warming. Then it became climate change. And now you're going to start to hear the term climate justice. Just bear in mind it's coming down. And if you go home after this, Google it, it will start to come up. So if social justice is about redistribution culturally, climate justice is about redistribution globally. I'm preparing you because it's going to come down the pike. Here are some top social justice issues from various publications and universities, just so that you can get an idea of how prevalent this is. This is from Social Work Today publication. the top 5 issues. Celebrating diversity, but now you know what diversity is. Child welfare, healthcare reform, poverty and economic injustice, and affordable housing. That's social work today. Maryville University. Here are their top 4 social justice issues: climate change, racial equity, LGBTQ plus rights, affordable healthcare. Yeshiva University. What does Yeshiva University have to say? Number 1, justice. 2, healthcare. 3, refugee crisis. 4, racial justice. 5, income gap. 6, gun violence. 7, hunger, food insecurity. 8, equity. Let me just say this, because I got exposed to this. I mean, we're all exposed to it, but I got most of my first taste of it in seminary. Because it was, I went to seminary in the early 90s, and 1989 when these publications were starting to go out and starting to make waves. And so I was kind of like, but that's where I started to see this play out, and immediately was very confusing to me, as it is for everyone. But nobody tells you the background of where these ideologies are coming from. They just use the term and are relying on you to translate those terms into what you once knew what they were. Because if you actually knew what they meant by those terms, you would reject it. But they use the terms expecting you to translate diversity as you've always understood diversity. So, generally, a church will jump in, if this is a train, the boxcar that they jump in is on the race issue. Because as Christians, we love the brothers. We love each other, and racism is hideous. There's no place for it in the body of Christ, none. And if there's racism, we got to deal with it. We got to pray about it. We got to deal with it because it's not godly at all. It's anti-God. So that typically is a card that someone will jump in on and say, let's do, and this is usually how it is presented, let's do a sensitivity training. And then this terminology comes in, and the terminology sounds good, but it's really confusing. It feels confusing. And then you jump on that train, or that car, not realizing that the engine that's pulling that car is critical theory, critical race theory, intersectionality. And once you're on that car, you are also attached to LGBTQ rights and climate justice rights and all this stuff, and you can't get off. You can't get off. Scott and I had this conversation not too long ago in terms of he's at Christ the King Lutheran Church. Say hi, Scott. Yeah. Sober up, Scott. So we were trying to figure out if any of our colleagues that went this direction, do you kind of go at some point in time, you know what, this is not right. No, I not know one. Maybe they're out there. I don't know any. I'm just saying. Usually once you jump on that thing, you're on for the ride. And you're really happy if your church goes down to 3 people as long as they're 3 different diverse people. You're willing to change language, gender language, whatever. That's where we've gotten. So that's how oftentimes. Now let's get back to, this is Education for Justice. It's an organization that's on the web. This is their list of top social justice issues. Take a deep breath. Consumerism. Death penalty. Number 3, education. 4, genocide. 5, homelessness. 6, human trafficking. 7, immigration. 8, intergenerational justice. 9, land grabbing. 10, mental health. 11, natural disasters. 12, racial justice. 13, restorative justice. 14, sexual abuse crisis in the church. 15, terrorism. 16, U.S. elections. 17, water. 8, climate change. 19, hunger. 20, migration. 21, economic justice. 22, inequality. 23, torture. 24, gender equality. 25, interfaith. 26, U.S. poverty. 27, war. 28, healthcare, and it goes on. Why are those? Because everything Everything is a social justice issue. Everything is about redistribution. For social justice, for race, it doesn't matter what critical theory you apply it to, whether you're applying it to social justice or race or gender, whatever. Whatever you're going to do, everything is about redistribution until you see equity. And until you see equity, there's oppression everywhere. Now, to get there, you're going to have to use force. You cannot get there without force because it's not natural. There's no natural occurrence in this entire world of equity. So you're trying to force something that's not natural. And Ibram X. Kendi, this is the guy who's very prominent, very prominent. And this is what the Lutheran Church, this is the Gather magazine, a women's magazine for the ELCA. Talking about, the article, by the way, is finding a way to be for racial justice. Now that sounds good. And they're hoping that you take that term, racial justice, and define it the way you've been taught racial justice is in the 60s. But now you know what they mean. The congregation's first step was to launch a racial justice and equity small group. These are different congregations and what they did. What do we need to learn to be able to understand how our church fits into the whole complexion of whiteness in a rather diverse community, Albert asks. First, they explored the nature of power, privilege, and leadership. I'm skipping over so that you don't have to go through the whole thing. To find those clues, many congregations, not Grace, but many congregations and synodical women's organizations spent last summer discussing books at the top of the bestseller list, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, who was a devout atheist. Marx was an atheist. Gramsci's an atheist. Kimberly Crenshaw's an atheist. But we're going to bring him into the church because they're using terminology that sounds like something we should be doing. And when it gets confusing, it divides the church. It's destructive, and if you can't see it for what it is, it will suck you in. This is the book. And another book, America's Original Sin, which is written by the founder of Sojourners magazine, which is a Christian magazine. How to be a racist, anti-racist. I've got some time. Let me just do this. Gosh, I wish I got paid $20,000 to $40,000 an hour. I'd only speak twice a year. I'd be out there. Minnesota has 10,000 lakes. I'd like at least fish in 5,000 of them. Oh, you need to, I'll do another speech. Here's my thanks for my $35,000. I'll see you next year. Can we cut that out, by the way, of the video? No? No. All right. This is a proposed anti-racist amendment to the Constitution that Ibram X. Kendi is propagating. He wants an amendment to the Constitution. And this is the quote. I'm going to quote it so that you know exactly how he is going to force this into American culture. This is a quote, to fix the original sin of racism. Can I just stop there? You don't get a chance to use our terms. You're an atheist. I can talk about sin. I come from that line of theological thinking. You don't get to take my terms to a godless ideology. But to fix the original sin of racism, it's hard for me to get beyond that. Because really, ultimately, this is not so much an ideology as it is a religion. It's got its own doctrine. It's got their own saints. They've got their own canon. They've got their own priests. They've got their own theologians. Jim Wallace, the founder of Sojourners magazine, which is a Christian magazine, has a book called America's Original Sin. And somehow we thought it would be a good idea to bring that into the church and do a study on it. Yeah, silly writers that are pushing something that is very destructive. It also bleeds into the 1619 project, but that's another thing. This is a quote. I'm going to go back. This is Ibram X. Kendi and his proposed amendment, anti-racist amendment. Sounds good. Anti-racist amendment to the Constitution. To fix the original sin of racism, Americans should pass an anti-racist amendment to the Constitution that enshrines two anti-racist principles. One, racial inequality is evidence of racist policy. Anytime there's inequity, it's because of racist policies. And only racist policies. This is the same group, by the way, that wants to dismantle the nuclear family, which studies have proven if you have a father in the home, it greatly reduces violence, crime, etc. But you can't talk about that, because talking about that from this, I can't say a word. Talking is an application of power. Only a critical racist can do that. I mean, a critical theorist. Two things. Racial inequality, inequity is evidence of racist policy. Two, that different racial groups are equals. The amendment would make unconstitutional racial inequity over a certain threshold, as well as racist ideas by public officials with racist ideas and public officials clearly defined. They're going to monitor equity at every level. And if there's any policy that demonstrates there's an inequity or inequitable outcome, then it's labeled racist and we've got to fix it. And it will only be done by force. It would establish and permanently fund the Department of Anti-Racism, comprised of formally trained experts on racism and no political appointees. This is an amendment that he's proposing. The DOA would be responsible for pre-clearing all local, state, and federal public policies to ensure they won't yield inequity. They will monitor those policies, investigate private racist policies when racial inequity surfaces, and monitor officials for expressions of racist ideas. The DOA would be empowered with disciplinary tools to wield over and against policymakers and public officials who do not voluntarily change their racist policy and ideas. That's a quote. And this person is infiltrated institutions, CEOs. My brother is working for a very prominent company in Minneapolis. They are not required, but very much encouraged to read this. They have a group at his company called the White Allies. What are White Allies, you might ask? They are people from this group who have made a pledge to practice anti-racism. And if you don't agree with that group, you're still in the ignorant part of the portion. Let me just take and back up just one second. With regards to our faith, forget the critical theory and all the stuff we're talking about. I mean, that's one thing is has to be dealt with. But racism in general, it's always a matter of the heart. Sin is a matter of the heart. Contempt, malice, jealousy, covetousness, that's a matter of the heart. And for us, no public policy, no bureaucracy is going to be able to fix it, because lives can only be changed by the person and work of Jesus Christ. That's it. But layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. You want to know how deeply I just read to you, well, I talked about the new position in our synod office, the new position for authentic, diversity, inclusive community. I have no idea what they're going to be doing. I think they're going to try to get more Norwegians than Swedes. Christ in our home, Friday, July 9th. This is a devotional, by the way. Should we strive to always be nice to others? Minnesota nice, you know. Well, yes and no. Sometimes our desire to be nice to others does harm. Niceness can sometimes be an excuse not to challenge racism and systems of white privilege. Niceness can protect the status quo to the detriment of people who are marginalized and oppressed. That's a devotional about Jesus Christ. What's that? This is Christ in our home, July 9th. And the Baptist convention is having to go through theirs. Tom can attest to that. My racist friend Tom. Right? It's everywhere. It's everywhere. And it can only go forward as long as people are not aware of the ideologies that are behind the terms that are currently being used. If you know what is meant by that, and not what you previously have been taught, you can go, because I really think in some ways there's a lot of, and I'm debating on that, maybe good intentioned people, I'm not sure, that have bought into that. I don't know. You have to, there's something not right from the get-go, but that's something I'm working out. Here's a quote from Milton Friedman, an economist. A quote from him says, "A society that puts equality in the sense of equality of outcomes ahead of freedom will end up with neither equality nor freedom. The use of force to achieve equality will destroy freedom. And the force introduced for good purposes will end up in the hands of people who use it to promote their own interests." So, I think what I'm going to do is open this up now for discussion. There's some other stuff, but I know what it looks like when you're drowning in the deep end of the pool. And believe me, I don't want to have to be doing this work. But whether you want war or don't, war wants you. And this has come upon us whether we wanted it or not. So here we are. And by God's grace and through his Spirit, he'll direct us where, when, what we need to do, what we need to say, who we need to talk to, etc. But I do want to open it up for discussion, questions, clarity, those kind of things. Yeah, question, David. Mm-hmm. The idea, okay, truth being found only in the subjective lived reality of oppression. That idea came originally from Marx, the oppressor, but I shouldn't say it didn't come from Marx. Marx still believed in objective truth. Marx still believed in objective truth. 2 + 2 is 4. This came post-modernism, when you have structuralism that says language is now power, and especially through Foucault, who equated knowledge, truth, and power to be the same thing. Well, if that's the same thing, how are you ever going to know truth? Well, only the critical theorists who have been skilled and educated and developing these ideas, they're the only ones that can truly see what's happening. So they have the truth. They have the truth. What we're experiencing, the question was, you think people will be able to see through this stuff, but it keeps moving through the society. In my opinion, the vast majority of people just want to be left alone. And there was a period of time in which I think the vast majority of people had a certain level of trust with various institutions. Whether it was your medical institution, whether it was your local government, whether it was the nightly news, journalism, was some kind of trust. But one of the things that is important to remember, and this goes back to Gramsci. This is very important. I'm glad that you brought that up because I want to bring this out. Gramsci came up with the idea of cultural hegemony, and because, remember, critical theory is conflict theory applied to culture. It's about finding how the structures fail people so you can, like, for example, the law enforcement. It's not about reforming the law. It's about defunding the whole thing, get rid of it all. That's a Marxist idea. Okay? So, because now, because now we can manipulate society in the way that we want to get equity. But bear in mind, even if equity is proven to be there, then the truth still doesn't matter because people that are saying the truth are people that have fooled themselves into thinking that it's truth and only they know the truth. This is why, for example, you can have pictures of, at a protest, a black police officer in riot gear and a 20-something-year-old white woman screaming in his face. Have you ever seen those pictures? How does that happen? Wait, well, because as a police officer, you are systemically promoting and propagating up the systemic power that runs through everything, and you don't even know it. Only she knows it because she read a critical theorist book, Robin DiAngelo. So she knows it because of that. So, like I said, it's a very, very limited ideology. And it's uncompromising. It's either you see it that way or you're blinded and you have internalized, that's another key phrase, you have internalized racism, and therefore I'm going to have to shut you down. So Gramsci came up with this idea of hegemony. And here's the thing. If you're going to then overthrow this, how are you going to overthrow this power structure? I mean, if it's just in economics, if you're just focusing on economics like Marx did, that's easy. You just take the company and take it over. You just Venezuela the thing, right? Just take it over, and now the workers all own it, and workers unite. Now the workers own the means of production. Have you heard that term? Means of production means the factories. So if the workers now own and control, the workers control the means of production, now you can have equity. With Gramsci, you're controlling the means of cultural production. Controlling the means, you're not writing this down. What's wrong with you? Controlling the means of cultural production. How do you do that? You control the robes. Who are the people in robes? Judges. You get activist judges. Not judges that interpret the law, judges that are critical theorists. You control the robes, meaning professors in universities, pastors, politicians, and you leverage the robes to educate and mobilize the masses against the hegemonic powers. So you leverage the robes so that anyone over here that's fighting this can burn down a target and go free. Because property is whiteness. Go find out who the district attorney is in San Francisco and find out who's funding him. That's your homework. And that's why you can go in and with a big sack and just take all this stuff and walk right on out and flip them the bird on your way out. And they will do nothing. Why? Because you're leveraging the robes to mobilize the masses against the hegemonic power. You use the educational system, the political system, the judicial system to overturn the cultural hegemony. How do you do it politically? In politics now, by promising various groups that you will advocate for them. Identity groups. You promise this group, I'll get this group, I'll get this group, I get this group, I get this. And that's how you leverage political power. That's why you can have in politics a white, male, heterosexual, cisgender, able-bodied, native-born Christian person in politics representing the very people that he doesn't even belong to. That's how Gramsci approached it, and that's how it's playing out. Say what? Christian is a form of oppression. Yes. Uh-huh. Okay. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. 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 You know why, Joanne? Because you're everything but this. Where do we go? That's a great question. That's a great question. That's right. Until you see equity across the board. It isn't possible. You don't look at Venezuela, look at Cuba, it's not possible. But, okay, so let me just take, the question is, what do you do now? What do you do? Well, first of all, you're here. So now you are more informed than the vast majority of the people that the last 2 hours were out doing other things, okay? Second of all, get with people that are like-minded so that you don't feel like you're alone. And it's very challenging because one of the institutions that for many years we used to, or I believed we had a great deal of faith in was our church institutions. I don't trust them whatsoever. I'm not bagging on them. I'm not dissing them. I'm just saying, all right, I don't have any faith. I know I went through this system. So, right. So as an example of that, begin to speak out. I'll give one example and then we'll take another question and hopefully I answer a question. When we were collectively going through the process of selecting a new bishop, we broke into small groups. It was all Zoom because it was the COVID thing. And so we had a big group of I don't know how many people, and then we had smaller groups. And when we were in the smaller group, the question was posed to us, what would you like to see in the new bishop? What kind of skill set? What kind of focus? What kind of values, etc.? And I kept hearing the phrase, well, the bishop needs to be forward thinking. I have no idea what that means. But see, the ambiguity is already there. The bishop needs to be able to take head on this systemic racism. And I listened, and then someone else said that, and I said, yeah, all right. This is how I see it. The bishop's office is basically a formalized human resource department. And now it's going to go on, so, okay. But spiritual leadership is between me and the Holy Spirit, and that's it. And I don't rely on you to tell me. You might be a perfectly wonderful person. I'm not here to judge. I'm just saying, I don't buy into the top down. I don't buy in that this is a more holy space than this. I mean, we can give due respect and should, but the theology. So I said, I don't see that. First of all, the bishop's role is outside of being professional in what they do in terms of dealing with congregations and placement and all that kind of stuff. But the second thing is, I don't see, this is how I see it. There was a bunch of Europeans that came to America and they established migrant communities. Germans here, Norwegians here, Swedes here, etc. Danes over here, put the Norwegians way over there. And they brought their churches with them. And so you had the Norwegian Lutheran Church and this Lutheran Church and that Lutheran Church. And then the next generation, they said, we don't want to be ethnically identified. We're Americans, so we became the American Lutheran Church and the Lutheran Church of America. And then after they did that, then they merged, they became this big thing, right? And then the next generation of pastors gets into the pulpit and they turn around and say, oh, by the way, you're all racist. And it's not true. So stop it. Because you're calling someone, because here's the thing about this from a spiritual standpoint. You have now taken the position of the accuser. I'm going to say that again. You have now taken the position of the accuser. You are now a spokesman for Satan. And you don't even know it because the language sounds great. You're racist, you're racist, you're racist. No, you're not. You're a human being who, like every other human being, is in bondage to sin and cannot free ourselves. We have sinned in our thoughts and our words and our deeds, not because of equity, but because of our fallen nature. And if we don't get back to that, then we're going to be swept away. And if you are in a church that's caught into that, get out. Question. I know it sounds strong, and this is going to go on, but that's where it is. Unless you can hold your own, and the gospel is being preached, but it's not an easy toll.